The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It slid down the windows of Grant's downtown office like time refusing to pass. The air smelled like ink and ambition. I remember the hum of his espresso machine, the gleam of polished wood, and the way his pen tapped against the desk with calculated rhythm as he said, "You're finally ready to make this official." He smiled like it was a proposal. In a way, it was. When we started Mercer Innovations, I was the one who built the product, my code, my designs, my sleepless nights. Grant had the network, the investors, the corporate Polish, the ability to make a room listen. He liked to call himself the closer. I was the creator. Together, we looked unstoppable. But that night, when I saw the words partnership agreement printed across the top of the document, something in me hesitated. 50-50, he said, sliding the folder across the desk. But since I'm taking on liability, I'll hold the voting rights, temporarily, until we prove scalability. It sounded logical, safe, and I was naive enough to believe him. I signed where he told me to sign. He kissed my forehead afterward, like sealing a promise. I didn't realize I had just signed away my voice. Nino, the night of our launch, he stood in front of reporters, his voice smooth and confident as he spoke about his vision, his dream, his company. When journalists asked about the design framework, he said, "My team built it. His team." I was standing right there. At first, I laughed it off. It was nerves, I told myself. It was a big night. But the pattern repeated. Investor dinners, podcasts, press interviews. We owe it all to Grant's vision. No one corrected him because they didn't know the truth, and I didn't correct him because I still loved him. We shared an apartment back then, a sleek, minimalist space that looked like a magazine cover. Every corner of it reflected his taste. The leather sofa, the marble coffee table, the art that matched the brand aesthetic. The only part that felt like me was the whiteboard in the corner, crowded with formulas, wireframes, and sticky notes. That was where the empire was really being built, quietly, obsessively, one idea at a time. Sometimes I'd find him standing there, watching me work. "You're brilliant. You know that?" he'd say, sliding his arms around me. "I made the right call bringing me in, as if I hadn't built the foundation he stood on." And the first real fight between us wasn't about love, it was about credit. We'd just landed a 6-figure contract with a Fortune 500 client. My algorithm had sealed the deal, but the congratulatory email arrived addressed only to Grant Mercer, CEO, and his talented team. I wasn't mentioned. When I pointed it out, he smiled the kind of smile that made me want to shatter glass. "Christina, the client doesn't care about names. They just want a single point of contact. That point of contact doesn't write the code," I said. "Neither do investors," he replied. "But they make things happen." That was Grant in a sentence. Power didn't belong to the builders. It belonged to the ones who could claim it first. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened our partnership agreement and read the clause again. "Primary strategic decisions shall remain under the authority of the managing partner until the company achieves Series A valuation." We were months away from that milestone. And every day, I felt myself shrinking. Brilliant but voiceless, creative but invisible. He began introducing me as the brains behind the operation, but his tone made it sound like I was his favorite project, not his partner. Investors adored him. The press adored him. And somewhere in the blur of success, I realized he didn't want a partner. He wanted a mirror that reflected his genius back at him. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that once we hit our first valuation goal, he'd restore the balance, give me my seat at the table. But deep down, I already knew better. Power, once tasted, is never surrendered willingly. So I started keeping records, emails, notes, drafts, and every single file that had my name in the metadata. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was survival. And as the company grew, so did my quiet understanding of the game I was playing. He believed the fine print made him untouchable. He believed I would always play nice. But he'd forgotten something essential about builders like me. We don't destroy what we make. We rebuild it, better. And when we do, we make sure no one else can take the credit. Power doesn't always arrive with a declaration. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as help. After our first round of funding, Mercer Innovations finally had what we'd been chasing for 2 years. Liquidity, investors, media attention, a sense of inevitability. Grant celebrated by ordering an espresso machine that cost more than my first car and installing it in his office to symbolize refinement. He gave a speech about legacy and leadership, and I gave a silent prayer of thanks that I might finally be able to breathe. But control isn't something Grant ever shared. He only delegated it long enough to prove he could take it back. The first sign came when he suggested we consolidate our finances for efficiency. Joint account, he said, waving his signature pen like a wand. One line of credit, one vision, one dream. It sounded romantic. The language of partnership always does when you want to believe it. But I remember watching him sign the bank documents, his hand resting casually over the fields where my name should have gone. He said, "Don't worry, I'll handle the admin stuff. It's boring." And just like that, the company credit card arrived in his name only. I told myself it didn't matter. I still had access. I still had control of the product, the innovation pipeline, the code. But control doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. One decision, one signature, one trust me. At the beginning, I didn't notice the shift. He was charming in boardrooms, lethal in negotiations. Investors loved him. And in tech, charisma is currency. I'd sit beside him during meetings, adding quiet clarifications, watching him translate my technical explanations into sound bites that made money move. It was teamwork, at least on the surface. But outside those rooms, his tone changed. He began correcting me mid-sentence in front of our staff, finishing my thoughts like he owned them. He'd turn strategy sessions into lectures. "You're brilliant," he'd say, "but you need direction. That's what I'm here for. Direction." As if genius needed permission to exist. He started managing optics. When we met new partners, he'd introduce me as the creative half of the operation. It was a compliment dressed like a cage. The unspoken half of that sentence was always, "And I'm the serious one who makes the real decisions." At conferences, he'd invite me to panels about women in innovation, as though my gender was the most interesting thing about my work. When I told him I wanted to keynote the next event, he laughed. "Christina, the investors don't want emotion. They want certainty. Let me handle it." Certainty. That word became poison to me. It took me another 6 months to see what he was really doing. The company's new CFO, a man Grant hired from his old firm, began routing all expense reports through his office. Travel reimbursements, vendor payments, even software subscriptions I'd set up personally now required his authorization. One afternoon, when I submitted a proposal for expanding our R&D team, Grant called me into his office. He was all smiles, holding a tumbler of whiskey and gesturing toward the city view like a benevolent emperor. "I've been looking over your numbers," he said. "They're solid, but we need to be careful with spending. Investors are watching closely. R&D is spending," I said. "That's how we stay ahead." I know, he sighed, walking around the desk to stand behind me, his hand settling on my shoulder. "That's why I'm limiting your discretionary budget for now. Once we hit our next milestone, we'll reevaluate." He called it risk management, but what he really meant was control management. And that night, I opened the financial dashboards he didn't realize I still had access to. His personal reimbursements were hidden under client development. Thousands of dollars spent on private dinners, 5-star hotel stays, and corporate entertainment. All of it charged to the company card. All of it justified under my signature. He'd made me complicit. The realization hit like static in my brain, an electric hum of humiliation and rage. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft by design. I stayed late at the office that night, long after the cleaning crew left. The hum of the servers kept me company as I downloaded every document, every receipt, every trace of his manipulation into a secure drive. My hands were shaking, but my focus had never been sharper. That was the first night I didn't cry. I planned. And by the time Grant came home, it was past midnight. He smelled like expensive wine and triumph. "You're still working?" he asked, slipping out of his jacket. "Someone has to keep the company running," I said, without looking up. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. "That's my girl, always grinding. I tell people you're the reason we're so far ahead." He said it like praise, but it landed like an insult. Later, when I checked my phone, I saw he'd posted a photo on LinkedIn. Another late night at Mercer HQ. Couldn't do it without my team. My name wasn't mentioned. Again. And the following week, we hosted a corporate retreat, a glossy PR stunt for investors, complete with motivational speakers and branded gift bags. Grant opened the event with a speech about leadership. I watched from the back as he paced the stage, voice rich and authoritative, reciting phrases I'd written for our media deck. When he said, "Our success is a reflection of vision meeting discipline," the crowd applauded. He smiled, perfect and untouchable. Afterward, I caught him backstage. "You quoted my work," I said quietly. He blinked. "Our work. No, Grant. My phrasing, my slides, my research." He tilted his head, smiling like a parent humoring a child. "You really need to let go of this obsession with credit, Christina. It makes you look small. Small." That word stayed with me like a splinter under my skin. Not that night. In the privacy of my hotel room, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my college mentor, Dr. Hanley, the professor who'd first told me I was dangerously capable. When I explained what was happening, she listened in silence. Then she said, "He's not a partner, Christina. He's a parasite. Parasites only thrive when the host forgets what she's feeding." She gave me the number of a corporate lawyer she trusted. "You don't have to burn it all down yet," she said. "Just learn where the matches are kept." In the next morning, I began my quiet audit. Every system I'd built for the company still bore my fingerprints. Logins, architecture, integration notes. Grant thought control was about money, but real control was information. And information was mine. I mapped out every project he'd claimed credit for, traced every patent draft back to my original blueprints, and stored everything on a cloud drive under an innocuous label. Training videos. Internal use only. It wasn't revenge. It was documentation. But the more I collected, the more a new kind of strength took shape inside me. A strategic calm I hadn't felt before. He'd underestimated me because I'd allowed it. Because I'd confused silence with loyalty and composure with weakness. He had the credit line, but I had the blueprint. And one day soon, I'd make sure everyone else did too. Before we go deeper, if you've ever watched someone take credit for your work, or felt invisible in a room you helped build, subscribe. Because the next chapter isn't about survival anymore. It's about the art of taking everything back without ever raising your voice. That power doesn't crumble in silence. It cracks in the noise of applause that starts to sound wrong. By the time the magazine cover came out, I'd already stopped expecting fairness. "The visionary behind Mercer Innovations," it read, Grant's face airbrushed into perfection. The tagline underneath made me laugh out loud. He credits his success to teamwork, grit, and his ability to lead with empathy. Empathy. That word, in his mouth, was almost poetic. He'd sent me a copy, casually tossed onto my desk with a post-it note. We did it. Not we were featured. Not they recognized us. Just we did it. As if the article had been another victory in a game he played against me and somehow won. I opened it that night, reading through the quotes that didn't sound like him, but were clearly edited to make him sound like a man of integrity. "My partner and I complement each other perfectly," he told the journalist. "She brings creativity. I bring discipline. Creativity and discipline." The unspoken hierarchy was built right into the sentence. By the third paragraph, I realized my role in the story had been reduced to a footnote. Christina Lang, the company's design director, is known for her innovative approach to product architecture. Design director, not co-founder, not partner, just another employee. That was the moment I stopped trying to win his approval. From then on, I wanted to win the narrative, and the shift was invisible at first. I smiled when I needed to, nodded in meetings, let him talk. But I started making small surgical moves, changes no one noticed except the ones paying attention. I began scheduling team stand-ups without inviting him, framing them as technical syncs. I encouraged our engineers to present their own ideas during updates instead of filtering everything through Grant. It wasn't rebellion. It was correction. The younger developers began approaching me directly. They'd whisper frustrations between tasks, careful to avoid the open plan cameras. "He keeps taking credit for the UI update. Did you see the press deck?" He cut my name again. I'd nod, listening, collecting patterns. They weren't ready to leave him yet, but the seed was planted. Mercer Innovations wasn't his empire anymore. It was our discontent. Then came the Transparency Initiative. It was Grant's idea, or at least his attempt at a rebrand. He wanted to show the world that the company was ethical, innovative, forward-thinking. He announced a series of internal videos where employees would share their journeys. When his assistant asked me to film mine, I smiled and said yes. And when the camera rolled, I didn't talk about Grant. I talked about process, about innovation, collaboration, shared ownership. Every sentence I spoke was a scalpel cutting away the mythology he'd built around himself. The footage went viral on LinkedIn within a week. Thousands of comments flooded in. Founders, engineers, investors, people praising my clarity, my insight. Grant pretended to be proud. "You're trending," he said, smiling too wide. "That's great for the brand." But I saw it in his eyes. He hated it. For the first time, I wasn't his accessory. I was competition. And 2 weeks later, the sabotage began. It started subtly. Miscommunications in meeting invites, projects reassigned without notice, tasks lost in the workflow. A senior developer named Rachel pulled me aside one morning, her voice low. "He's telling people your workload's slipping, that you're overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. The same word he'd used when we first started dating, when I told him I wanted to run my own company one day. "You're brilliant, Christina, but you overwhelm easily. Let me handle the pressure." It was his oldest weapon, undermining confidence disguised as concern. This time, I didn't argue. I let the rumor spread. I let him think I was retreating, because while he was busy defending his image, I was building a mirror version of our infrastructure, one that answered to me alone. Every empire falls from within. I knew his weakness wasn't money or even ego. It was credibility. Without the illusion of moral superiority, he was just another corporate manipulator with a fancy logo. So I started collecting witnesses. Janet from operations had noticed how Grant rewrote budgets to hide personal expenses. She was tired of cleaning up his mess. Devin from legal had been instructed to adjust phrasing on internal contracts to protect Grant's control of intellectual property. He didn't like it. And our lead engineer, Malik, had watched Grant take credit for his patentable algorithm in front of investors. One by one, I offered them what Grant never could: acknowledgement, not bribes, not promises, just credit where it was due. By the time the next press cycle came around, Mercer Innovations had quietly developed a heartbeat that pulsed to my rhythm, not his. And the article that broke him wasn't mine. It was Rachel's. She wrote a post about toxic leadership, never naming names, but the subtext was obvious to anyone inside the company. It spread fast. The comments section exploded with engineers and designers echoing her words, liking, resharing, hinting. Grant's phone started buzzing nonstop. He called an emergency meeting to address internal concerns. I sat through it in silence as he talked about loyalty, teamwork, and our shared vision. His voice wavered for the first time, the mask slipping. When he said, "We're a family," I actually laughed, out loud. He glared at me, jaw tight. "Something funny, Christina?" I met his eyes. Families don't need NDAs. The room went still. I saw it in the faces around the table. The first flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, they weren't crazy. That the version of reality he'd sold them wasn't the truth. Then later that night, I got a message from one of our interns. "If you ever start something of your own, I'd follow you there." I stared at the screen for a long time, my chest tightening with something that wasn't quite joy yet. It was recognition. The first spark of rebellion finding oxygen. Grant didn't know it yet, but his company had already started migrating, employee by employee, belief by belief, toward me. He still thought power was about ownership. He didn't realize it was about influence. The next morning, I drafted an internal memo announcing a temporary leave for personal development. Grant approved it instantly, eager to appear generous in front of the board. He didn't ask what I planned to do with my time. He didn't know that I'd already registered a new business license under my name, Lang Systems. The same engineers he'd neglected were already helping me test prototypes after hours. The same legal team he'd overworked was quietly drafting contracts for my own firm, and the same PR manager who'd written his glowing headlines was about to write mine. If you've ever watched someone weaponize perception against you, remember this: the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs proof and patience. Grant still believed he controlled the story, but the audience was already mine. Leaving wasn't about walking out. It was about walking away so quietly that the ground beneath him would shift before he realized I'd stopped standing there. By the time Grant's transparency initiative imploded under the weight of its own hypocrisy, I had already written my resignation letter 7 different times. Not to send it, just to know I could. Each draft was a small act of freedom, each unsent email a rehearsal for detachment. The decision came one Tuesday morning when I caught my own reflection in the mirrored wall of the boardroom. I looked like him. Tailored suit, measured tone, polite smile. I had become fluent in his language. Calculated, inoffensive, endlessly strategic. That terrified me more than anything he'd ever done. I'd built something beautiful, then watched it become a cage. And worse, I'd let him convince me the bars were there to keep danger out, not to keep me in. That morning, while he bragged about new contracts and market dominance, I was already drafting the document that would end his illusion of ownership forever. It wasn't a resignation letter. It was something far sharper, a legal motion. When people think of revenge, they imagine rage, fury, drama. But real revenge is administrative. It's a process. It's patient and methodical, and written in 12-point font. Mine started with a conversation over coffee with Malik, our lead engineer. He'd been the quiet observer through all of it, loyal to the work, not the man. When I told him I was leaving, he didn't try to stop me. He just nodded once and said, "Tell me where to sign." Within a week, 4 more senior staff members reached out privately. They didn't need convincing. They'd been watching the same decay from the inside, the nepotism, the unpaid overtime, the ever-growing stack of NDAs that made Mercer Innovations look less like a company and more like a containment unit for secrets. I told them the truth. I'm not trying to destroy Grant. I'm building something that doesn't need him. Lang Systems was born that night, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I T1 the worm, and the first step was reclaiming what was mine. The architecture, the code, the ideas buried in his servers and mislabeled under his name. I had to do it carefully. If I downloaded anything directly, it would flag in the system logs. So I recreated it from memory, line by line. I built the same product from the ground up in a new workspace, a cleaner version stripped of the arrogance that had infected his brand. Malik handled the back-end structure. Rachel assembled a new UX team. Janet from operations managed the legal paperwork, coordinating with the lawyer Dr. Hanley had recommended months earlier. For weeks, I played both roles. Mercer's obedient partner by day, Lang Systems' founder by night. My apartment became headquarters. My living room filled with whiteboards again. Coffee cups stacking like trophies of insomnia. I'd forgotten how a live creation could feel when it wasn't being watched. Naseten, Grant started noticing the distance. Are you distracted lately? He asked one evening. We were still sharing an office, though I'd begun spending most of my time working remotely. Just tired, I said. He smiled, that condescending curl of lip that had once charmed investors and now made my skin crawl. You work too hard, Christina. You should learn to delegate. I had. He just didn't realize he wasn't the one I was delegating to anymore. And the turning point came with the annual shareholder presentation. It was supposed to be his victory lap, a polished recap of profits, growth metrics, and new initiatives. He rehearsed in front of the mirror for days, obsessed with optics. What he didn't know was that 2 of the key investors he planned to impress had already met with me privately. They'd seen my documentation, the proof of who had written the code, designed the framework, built the partnerships. I didn't ask them to choose sides. I just showed them the truth. And truth, once seen, can't be unseen. When Grant stood on stage and clicked through the slides I'd prepared, I watched the investors' expressions change. It was subtle at first. A raised eyebrow, a slight lean back in their chairs. But I saw it. The recognition. The dawning realization that they were looking at a man taking credit for someone else's genius. That night, one of them texted me, "If you ever decide to start something on your own, we'd like to talk." From that moment, I moved like someone who already knew the ending. Every email I sent was deliberate. Every conversation recorded in careful notes. I didn't need confrontation. I needed evidence. The next phase was financial separation. Our joint account had always been a tool of control, so I drained my half, every cent legally mine according to our contract. Grant didn't notice for weeks. He was too busy filming promotional videos about leadership values. When he finally did, he called me at midnight, voice tight with disbelief. "Did you move money out of the account?" "I moved my earnings," I said evenly. "That's not how this works, Christina." "Actually," I said, opening the PDF of our agreement, "that's exactly how it works. Section 7.2, distribution of personal equity prior to dissolution." Silence. Then the sound of his breath, ragged and furious. "You're overreacting." "No," I said. "I'm preparing." Over the next month, I transitioned every team member who trusted me into quiet collaboration. Officially, they were still employed by Mercer. Unofficially, they were designing for Lang Systems under consulting contracts that would activate upon my public resignation. Rachel once joked, "It feels like we're smuggling people across borders." In a way, we were. The border between exploitation and freedom. By the time I scheduled my final meeting with Grant, everything was in place. The new company structure, the funding offers, the patents under my name, and the press release written by the same journalist who'd once erased me from his story. When I walked into his office that morning, the air felt colder. The skyline behind him was wrapped in fog, Seattle gray and endless. He looked up from his laptop, smiling like a man who still thought the world was under his control. "You're early," he said. "Big day. The new contract came through." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm leaving." The words hung between us, perfectly calm. He blinked. "Leaving what?" "The company." He laughed, waiting for the punchline. "I'm serious, Grant. Effective immediately." His smile dropped. "You can't just walk away from everything we built. Watch me." He stood, hands flat on the desk. "Do you have any idea what that looks like? You'll tank your reputation." I met his eyes. "You already did that for me. I'm just reclaiming the credit." For the first time since I'd met him, he looked scared. Not of losing me, but of losing the narrative. By the end of the week, the press release went live. Former co-founder of Mercer Innovations launches Lang Systems with former Mercer team members. The article framed it as a creative split, but the subtext was clear. Investors flocked. Employees followed. Even clients began migrating contracts. Grant called twice, then stopped. His silence was its own confession. Lang Systems went operational within 30 days, and when our first prototype outperformed Mercer's flagship product, the headlines wrote themselves. The true visionary emerges. But the victory didn't feel like fire. It felt like air, clean, weightless, undeniable. People ask if I regret how I left. I don't. The hardest part wasn't walking away. It was realizing I'd been holding the door open for someone who never planned to walk through it with me. Leaving wasn't revenge. It was correction. And soon, correction would become consequence. The first week after I left felt unreal, like I was living inside the echo of a building that had already collapsed. Every sound, email pings, Slack notifications, even the hum of my refrigerator, reminded me of Mercer's offices, of the noise he created to prove he still existed. Freedom doesn't arrive with fanfare. It shows up as quiet, and the quiet can be terrifying. I spent those first mornings sitting by the window with coffee that actually tasted like coffee, not adrenaline. No calendar alerts, no urgent meetings about colors of logos or wording of press releases, no Grant, but peace, at least at the beginning, felt like guilt dressed in comfort. Half the team who'd joined Lang Systems were still technically Mercer employees. They sent me encrypted messages at odd hours. He's asking questions. He's furious. He's threatening to cut everyone's bonuses. I told them to breathe, to wait, to let the paperwork speak before emotion did. I knew exactly how far he could reach, and exactly where the law began to block him. By Friday, the investors made their move. The same men who had once shaken his hand with performative admiration now wanted answers. They'd seen the numbers. They'd seen the exodus. And more importantly, they'd seen the difference. How Lang's prototype, rebuilt from the same architecture he'd ignored, performed 3 times faster at half the cost. Grant called me that night. "Congratulations," he said. Voice flat, controlled. "You've made your point." "I wasn't making one," I replied. "I was making progress. You're destroying everything we built." "No, Grant. I'm saving what's left of it." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing through the phone, that slow inhale he used before a pitch meeting, when he needed to reset his tone from anger to persuasion. "Christina," he said softly, "you wouldn't have that prototype without me." I almost laughed. "That's true. I wouldn't have built it this way without you. You taught me exactly what not to do." The line went silent. Then he hung up. Then 2 days later, a journalist emailed me asking for comment on rumors of internal collapse at Mercer Innovations. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. The story was already writing itself. By the end of the month, 3 executives resigned. 2 investors froze funding pending clarity of leadership. A whistleblower leak revealed that Grant had inflated quarterly growth projections by 27% to maintain his valuation. The board panicked. They brought in auditors. Grant's empire had always looked invincible because it was made of glass and mirrors. Now the light was finally hitting it from the right angle. But meanwhile, Lang Systems grew faster than any of us expected. We weren't glamorous. We were efficient. No marble desks, No espresso machines. No staged photo ops. Just work. We shared an old warehouse space in Ballard. Cold in the mornings, hot in the afternoons. But the hum of real creation filled it. When Malik demoed the first stable build, everyone applauded like kids seeing fireworks for the first time. We weren't chasing hype. We were chasing function. For months I'd lived with tension coiled inside my chest like wire. Now it began to unspool. Slowly. Painfully. Beautifully. But peace still came with ghosts. Every time an email pinged, I expected it to be Grant. Every new hire made me worry that they'd bring pieces of him with them. His arrogance, his politics, his habit of mistaking noise for leadership. I wanted to build something immune to him, but that meant confronting the part of me that had once admired the noise. And then came the first lawsuit. Grant filed it the same day Mercer's stock price dipped for the third consecutive week. The headline read, "Mercer Innovations sues former co-founder for intellectual property theft." When my lawyer, Eliza Bennett, called to break the news, I was already expecting it. "He's claiming the algorithm belongs to Mercer," she said. "We'll respond with the documentation showing you wrote the original code years before the partnership." I heard the faint smile in her voice. "Honestly, Christina, he's panicking. This is a tantrum in legal form." Still, the lawsuit hit harder than I'd anticipated. Not because I feared losing, but because I finally saw how far he'd fallen. To weaponize the one thing we'd both worshipped, creation. The next morning, Rachel found me sitting at my desk staring at the headline. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "You don't look fine. You look like someone reading an obituary." "In a way, I am." Thamari, and the legal proceedings dragged for weeks, then months. Grant's lawyers sent aggressive letters. Ours responded with quiet precision. Every time they tried to claim ownership, we produced a timestamp, a document, a witness. Every move he made only reinforced our evidence of his deception. And then, ironically, poetically, his own employees started testifying. Not under oath yet, but in whispers to the press, in anonymous statements to journalists, in leaked emails that showed he'd altered records to remove my name. The world began to connect the dots. Investors withdrew permanently. Clients migrated contracts to Lang Systems. By the end of the quarter, Mercer's valuation had dropped 60%. Grant held a press conference to address misinformation. I didn't watch it live, but clips flooded the internet. He looked different, thinner, eyes ringed with exhaustion, confidence stripped bare. His voice cracked mid-sentence when he said, "We remain committed to integrity." Integrity. That was the first thing he ever took from me. Now it was the last thing he had left to pretend. I thought victory would feel like fireworks. It didn't. It felt like gravity returning after a long fall. There's no manual for rebuilding your life from ashes you didn't light yourself. I tried to celebrate. We threw a small dinner at the office when the court dismissed his lawsuit with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile. Everyone cheered. Glasses clinked. Relief buzzed in the air. But later that night, when I got home, I sat alone in the dark and realized I didn't know what to do without a battle to fight. Peace, once earned, demands a different kind of discipline. For months, I'd defined myself as the woman who escaped him, the one who built something better. Now, I had to learn how to exist without comparison. A week later, I walked past Mercer's old building. The sign had been removed. The lobby was dark. Through the glass, I could still see the outline where their logo had been mounted, a ghost imprint of power once absolute. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt done, like the chapter had been written and signed, and there was nothing left to say. I left a single white tulip at the entrance before walking away, not as a message, just as closure, because even ruins deserve a kind of grace. When I got home that night, I opened my laptop to a message from Eliza. "Settlement complete. All claims dropped. You're officially clear." Underneath, she'd added a single line. "Congratulations. You won." I stared at those 2 words until the screen dimmed. Winning had always been Grant's obsession. For me, it felt strangely hollow, because what I'd really wanted all along wasn't to win against him. It was to win myself back. And the next morning, sunlight poured through my window. I brewed coffee. I opened my notebook. For the first time in years, there was no legal strategy, no defense plan, no PR crisis waiting, only blank pages. And that's when I realized collateral damage doesn't just describe what's lost. It also describes what survives, the things that endure after impact. Grant had lost his empire. but I hadn't lost myself, and sometimes survival is the quietest, most complete kind of revenge there is. It took me months to realize that survival and rebuilding were not the same thing. Survival was reaction, breath after blow, living on adrenaline and instinct. Rebuilding required intention, and intention was terrifying, because it meant imagining a future beyond defense. Lang Systems had stabilized faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months, we'd landed 2 government contracts, signed a partnership with a Scandinavian tech firm, and received more investor interest than we could manage. We were the new symbol of ethical innovation, everything Mercer Innovations had pretended to be. Journalists loved the irony. So did I at first. But success had a strange aftertaste now. Sweet, metallic, laced with fatigue. It wasn't the champagne glow of winning. It was the quiet hum of accountability. Every decision I made now carried weight. Every signature, every hire, every new product. When you've seen what power can do in the wrong hands, even your own hands start to feel dangerous. And the first sign that the war wasn't truly over came through an unexpected source. Malik. He knocked on my office door one rainy afternoon, holding his tablet with that uneasy look engineers get when they find something they wish they hadn't. I was running diagnostics on the legacy code we migrated, he said. Some of the old Mercer data packets are still pinging external servers. It's like someone's trying to access the backup through a mirror node. Someone? I asked, though I already knew who. Grant, Malik said. Or someone working for him. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. Of course he wouldn't let go. Grant never knew how to stop fighting a battle, even one he'd already lost. Can we block it? Not completely, he said. But we can trace it. He's desperate, Christina. Whatever he's looking for, he wants proof he still matters. That line stayed with me all night. Proof he still matters. Grant had built an empire on visibility, on being seen, quoted, photographed, adored. Now, stripped of it, he was clawing through the remains, trying to reconstruct himself from data and memory. I should have felt pity. Instead, I felt focus. And the next morning, I gathered my team. We tightened digital security, patched vulnerabilities, set legal alerts. But I didn't tell the press. I didn't want another public feud. If Grant wanted to play shadow games, I would let him play alone. Instead, I redirected the energy toward something new, rebuilding culture. For years, I had believed innovation was about product, the elegance of design, the brilliance of architecture, the sophistication of algorithms. But now I understood the real product of leadership was trust. Mercer Innovations had been full of brilliant people who never trusted each other, because fear was built into its DNA. At Lang Systems, I wanted something different. So I started with the simplest principle, transparency, not as a slogan, but as practice. Salaries were public. Decision-making was documented. Every team member, regardless of title, could challenge an idea. It was messy at first. People hesitated, uncertain how to unlearn hierarchy. But slowly, the old habits faded. Meetings became arguments that turned into breakthroughs. Slack threads turned into think tanks. People started owning things, not out of obligation, but pride. For the first time since I'd written the first line of code that started all this, I felt like I was building something that might outlast me. One night, I was locking up the office when Rachel stopped me in the hallway. She looked exhausted but satisfied, the kind of tired that comes from doing something that finally makes sense. You realize, she said, you've done the impossible, right? What's that? Built a company without ego. I laughed. Give it time. She shook her head. No, seriously. You don't lead like Grant did. You don't make people compete for approval. You give them ownership. Her words should have comforted me, but instead they unsettled me. Because ownership was what I'd wanted all along, and what Grant had weaponized. Could any of us really build without becoming what we escaped? That question haunted me more than I wanted to admit. 2 weeks later, I got an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "A coffee and a conversation." No signature, no body text, just an attached photo of our old office building. Mercer's logo now removed, the glass facade reflecting clouds. I didn't need a name to know who had sent it. I ignored it. Then another came, this time with words. You don't have to respond. Just know I finally understand what you were trying to build. For a moment, my finger hovered over reply. I wanted to say 1,000 things. That understanding didn't erase damage. That regret wasn't redemption. that his empathy now was too late, but I didn't type any of it. Some wars end, not because one side surrenders, but because the other stops showing up. I closed the message and archived it. And the next few months blurred into expansion. Contracts, hiring rounds, an award nomination I didn't attend. Every journalist wanted to ask about Grant. Every headline framed Lang Systems as a Phoenix story. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. A phoenix burns to rise again. I hadn't burned. I'd dismantled. Still, Grant lingered like a ghost in the machine. Every time an employee hesitated before challenging me, I heard his voice in the silence. Every time I saw my name trending, I remembered how dangerous praise could be. Success, after betrayal, comes with survivor's guilt. But the final closure came unexpectedly. Eliza, my lawyer, called on a gray Friday afternoon. Mercer's board filed for dissolution, she said. They're liquidating assets. Grant's officially out. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I thought of the first contract we'd signed together, the first late night at the office, the first press photo where he stood in front, and I smiled behind him. I thought of how much of my life had been built around trying to be seen by someone who only saw his reflection. What happens to him now? I asked finally. He'll probably start something new. He always does. Her tone softened. You could walk away now, you know. You've proven your point. I didn't build Lang Systems to prove anything, I said quietly. I built it because I couldn't keep pretending someone else's version of me was the truth. She smiled. Then you've already won. And that evening I went home early. The city outside my window glowed in the drizzle, each streetlight reflecting off wet pavement like circuitry. I brewed tea instead of coffee and sat at the table where, months earlier, I'd written my exit strategy. My laptop was filled with files, ideas, plans, yet for once, I didn't open it. Instead, I picked up my journal and wrote a single line. The empire he built taught me how to build without empires. The words felt final. But closure isn't a door that shuts. It's a horizon that keeps moving, and I was still walking toward it. I didn't know what the next chapter would bring. More growth, maybe mistakes, maybe even forgiveness. But for the first time, I was certain of one thing. I wasn't rebuilding to prove him wrong anymore. I was rebuilding because creation was the truest form of freedom I had ever known. And somewhere, in the architecture of everything he tried to claim, my fingerprints would remain, not as evidence of what he took, but as proof of what I reclaimed. It started, as most echoes do, faint and familiar. A name I thought I had buried found its way back into headlines again. Grant Mercer, reappearing not as a CEO but as a speaker. The event was called Reclaiming Failure, Lessons from the Fall of a Visionary. The irony could have filled a stadium. Someone tagged me in the announcement post on LinkedIn, probably expecting a reaction. I didn't give them one. I scrolled past it like any other piece of marketing fluff, but my chest tightened anyway. There he was, standing against a minimalist gray backdrop, his expression perfectly calibrated between remorse and resilience. The caption read, "After months of silence, Mercer breaks his silence with a story about loss, learning, and the power of second chances." Power of second chances. He'd turned his ruin into a brand. For days, I tried not to think about it. I buried myself in work, budget reviews, R&D meetings, late-night calls with our European partners. But silence has a way of amplifying the one voice you're trying to ignore. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something heavier. Recognition, maybe. Grant was doing what he'd always done, turning narrative into currency. By the end of the week, clips from his keynote began circulating online. He talked about hubris, about losing touch with the human side of innovation. He mentioned betrayal, never naming names, but anyone who knew the story understood the subtext. She was brilliant, he said, his voice soft, calculated. I failed to see it in time. Thousands of comments flooded in. So powerful. It takes real courage to own your mistakes. What a comeback story. Courage. Comeback. Redemption. He'd always known how to play to the crowd. Rachel knocked on my office door that morning holding her phone. "Have you seen this?" she asked. "Yes." "You're not going to respond?" I shook my head. He wants engagement. Let him echo himself into silence. Still, it stung. Because while he was performing contrition, I was living its consequences. Every time someone mentioned him, my own name resurfaced, attached to his, as if I were an accessory to his failure instead of the architect of my own success. You don't escape men like Grant. You outgrow them, but the world doesn't always let you forget them. "Mao," 2 weeks later, the universe decided to test my composure. I was invited to speak at a global innovation conference, the same event Grant had once headlined at the height of Mercer Innovation's power. The irony didn't escape me. The organizer's email was polite, but unmistakably strategic. "We'd love for you to join our closing panel. We believe your perspective on leadership and resilience would provide valuable contrast to Mr. Mercer's session earlier in the week." Contrast. That was their euphemism for confrontation. I almost declined. I didn't want to play the foil in his redemption narrative. But then I remembered the countless women who had written to me over the past year. Engineers, designers, entrepreneurs, telling me how my quiet defiance had helped them leave their own grants behind. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about showing what survival looked like when it didn't need applause. So I said yes. When the day arrived, the conference center buzzed like a hive. Screens flickered with sponsor logos and motivational slogans about failing upward. Backstage, I could hear the end of Grant's talk through the curtain. His voice carried the same rehearsed humility I remembered from investor dinners. "Failure," he said, "isn't the opposite of success. It's the foundation of it." The crowd erupted in applause. I could almost picture him, eyes glinting, posture relaxed, basking in the comfort of forgiveness. My session followed. When I stepped onto the stage, the audience was still buzzing, caffeinated by his story of regret and rebirth. The moderator smiled and said, "We are honored to have Christina Lang, founder and CEO of Lang Systems, to close our conference. Christina, you've been through a very public professional transformation. How do you define success now?" I took a slow breath and looked out at the rows of faces waiting for drama, for blood, for a soundbite. But I didn't give them what they wanted. I gave them what I'd learned. "Success," I said, "isn't survival. It's reconstruction. It's the quiet work of rebuilding without resentment. It's when you can look at the person who broke you and feel nothing. Not anger, not pity, just distance." The room went still. And then I added, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after losing everything is to stop needing the world to know who hurt you." The applause was hesitant at first, then thunderous, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. And afterward, as I was leaving the stage, I saw him. Grant stood near the exit, hands in his pockets, half smiling like a man unsure if he should say hello. He looked older, softer. The arrogance had been replaced by something quieter. Whether it was regret or exhaustion, I couldn't tell. "Christina," he said, "you were brilliant, as always." "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone polite, professional. He hesitated, eyes darting toward the crowd. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said up there." "I know," I replied. "You always mean what you say." At the time, he flinched, but I didn't feel satisfaction, only finality. "Maybe someday we can talk, off the record," he said. "No PR, no lawyers, just people." I looked at him, really looked, for the first time in years. The man who once commanded rooms now looked like a ghost, trying to remember who he was before the applause. "I think we already said everything that needed to be said," I told him. "We just said it in different languages." Then I walked away. And that night, my phone filled with messages. People called it the confrontation everyone wanted. But it wasn't a confrontation. It was closure disguised as calm. When I got home, I watched the recording once. Just once. In the frame, the contrast between us was stark. He performed redemption. I embodied release. For the first time, the story wasn't about who won. It was about who'd moved on. 3 months later, his name faded from the news cycle again. The world had absorbed his apology and moved on to its next narrative. And me? I kept building. Lang Systems launched a mentorship program for young women in tech. We partnered with universities, created open-source grants, built platforms that credited every contributor by name. Every new project felt like a correction to the old world I'd escaped. Sometimes, when I signed a partnership contract, I'd pause for a moment, remembering the girl who once signed away her rights for love disguised as opportunity. I didn't despise her anymore. I pitied her. I forgave her. Because without her, none of this would exist. The one evening, as I was leaving the office, Malik stopped me. "You ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "Every day," I said. He smiled. "And if Grant walked in here right now asking for a job?" I laughed, genuinely this time. "I'd give him a tour, show him what real leadership looks like. Then I'd walk him out." Malik grinned. "Fair." As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the glass. Calm, whole, Free. That was the real ending. Not the lawsuit, not the headlines, not even the applause. Just peace. Unperformed, unshared, mine. Patti. Power leaves echoes. Sometimes those echoes sound like applause. Sometimes they sound like silence. But if you listen long enough, you realize the quiet isn't emptiness. It's space. Space to build again, without ghosts. Space to exist without needing to prove you deserve it. And for the first time, I wasn't haunted by Grant Mercer's voice. I was listening to my own. Nandon Naus. At the first time I saw Maya, she reminded me of myself at 25. Sharp, restless, brilliant, and still unaware that brilliance could make you a target. She was our youngest project lead, recruited straight out of MIT, and she had that fierce optimism that only comes before you've been underestimated enough times to stop believing enthusiasm is protection. When she walked into my office that morning, laptop under her arm and frustration simmering just below the surface, I already knew something was wrong. "Got a minute?" she asked, though she was already sitting down. "Of course," I said, closing my notebook. "It's about the Orion proposal," she began, exhaling hard. "The client wants to go through a senior liaison, and they requested Malik instead of me." I frowned. "Did they give a reason?" "Not directly," she said, "but they told Malik they wanted someone with more experience representing the company." Translation: someone older, male, and safe. Her laugh was brittle. "You'd think in 2025 we'd be past this." I leaned back, watching her fight to keep her anger professional. It was a familiar performance. I'd perfected it years ago. The art of disguising outrage as strategy. "What do you want to do about it?" I asked. She hesitated. "I want to tell them that if they can't trust the person who built the system, they don't deserve the system. But I also want to keep my job." "That's the impossible balance," I said, being polite enough to stay in the room but honest enough to not disappear inside it. She smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed stormy. "You've done this before." "Too many times," I said. "Ashanan." After she left, I sat for a long time staring at the rain against my window. Seattle in March always looked like reflection itself. Wet glass, gray light, too many shades of almost silver. I thought about how many Mayas I'd met over the years. Women too competent to ignore, yet too threatening to celebrate. Each generation of us learned the same lesson. Success was never just about talent. It was about endurance. That afternoon, I called Malik. "Reassign the Orion account," I told him. "Maya presents. You and I will back her from the wings." He didn't even hesitate. Done. That was the thing about real leadership. It wasn't about control. It was about making sure the right people never had to ask twice to be seen. The presentation took place 2 days later in a conference room overlooking Elliott Bay. The clients, a trio of executives from a logistics firm, sat across from us, polished and predictable. Maya began with steady confidence, her voice cutting through the tension like glass through fog. She knew her numbers, her architecture, her projections. She didn't perform authority. She embodied it. Halfway through, one of the executives interrupted her. "That's an ambitious model," he said. "Who designed the predictive engine?" Maya's lips curved slightly. "I did," she said. "But I can walk you through the process if you'd like to understand it better." I nearly smiled. She had just weaponized grace. By the end of the meeting, they were asking her for follow-ups, nodding, scribbling notes, performing the choreography of respect they hadn't planned to give her. When we left the room, she exhaled deeply, like someone surfacing after a long dive. "How'd I do?" she asked. "You didn't do," I said. "You redefined." She laughed, but her eyes shone with something bigger than pride. Relief, recognition. Then that night, as the office emptied out, I found myself thinking about the word inheritance. Not money, not companies, but legacy. The quiet things we leave behind in others. When Grant lost everything, I swore I would never become a mentor. I didn't trust the concept. Power shared always risked turning into power abused. But watching Maya, I realized that withholding guidance out of fear was just another kind of control. Inheritance isn't about passing down what you built. It's about teaching someone how to build differently. So I invited her to coffee the next morning. "You handled yourself well," I said, once we'd settled in the corner booth of a quiet cafe. "Thanks," she said, smiling shyly. "I had a good example." I shook my head. "Don't copy me, Maya. Learn from me, but don't imitate me. My generation fought to be allowed in the room. Yours should fight to redesign the room entirely." She studied me for a moment. "Do you ever miss it?" Miss what? The fight. The adrenaline of proving them wrong. I looked out the window, watching traffic blur into streaks of silver and red. Sometimes, I admitted. But mostly I'm tired of proving anything. I'd rather build something that doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. Twars. A week later, a journalist reached out asking if I'd comment on the new generation of female tech leaders inspired by Christina Lang. The phrase made me uneasy. Inspiration always came with expectations, and expectations had nearly destroyed me once. Still, when the article was published, it wasn't about me at all. It was about Maya. Her face, her work, her voice quoted front and center. The caption read, "Lang Systems' next visionary." I felt a strange mix of pride and humility reading it. Grant would have hated sharing a headline. I found it liberating. And then, inevitably, came the backlash. The following week, an anonymous forum post claimed Maya's system borrowed heavily from Mercer Innovations' archived data. It was a lie, of course. A transparent attempt to drag her into the same mud I'd once crawled out of. But this time, it wasn't my name on the line. It was hers. I knew the tactics too well. Discredit the woman, distort the narrative, make her seem reckless instead of revolutionary. The question wasn't whether to respond. It was how. That night, I drafted a statement. Not angry, not defensive, just factual. Then I deleted it. This wasn't my battle. If I fought for her, she'd always be the woman Christina Lang defended. She needed to fight for herself and win. So instead, I called her. "Maya," I said, "you've seen the post?" "Yeah," she replied, voice trembling slightly. "They're saying I stole code. Did you?" "No." "Then say that, publicly, calmly, once, then keep working. The truth has more endurance than outrage." She hesitated. "What if they don't believe me?" "They won't," I said softly. "Not all of them. But that's how you know you're building something that matters." Her response went live the next morning. One paragraph, elegant, unapologetic. All code used in the Orion model was independently developed and fully audited. Lang Systems stands by transparency and innovation. Progress doesn't require permission. Within hours, the tide turned. Support flooded in. From clients, from women in tech, from people who'd watched this pattern too many times before. The post accusing her was deleted. The account disappeared. When Maya walked into my office later that day, I didn't congratulate her. I just handed her a coffee and said, "Welcome to leadership." She grinned. "It's not as glamorous as they make it look." "It never was," I said, "but it's ours now." On that night, I stood alone in the empty office, the city lights flickering like code through the glass. I thought about inheritance again, how every story we survive becomes the blueprint for someone else's foundation. Grant's empire had crumbled. Mine had evolved. And hers? It was still forming, unburdened by ghosts. That was the legacy worth leaving. Not revenge, not even redemption, but renewal. Because the truest kind of power isn't held, it's handed forward. And in that quiet moment, watching the glow of screens still burning across the city, I understood what I had built. Not a company, a future. The past doesn't knock when it wants to come back. It just walks in through the side door and sits down like it never left. By the time I heard Grant's name again, more than a year had passed since the conference. Long enough that I'd stopped flinching at mentions of him. Long enough that I'd started believing peace could be permanent. Lang Systems was thriving. Maya had become an industry voice in her own right. Malik was leading R&D teams across 3 continents. And I had finally taken my first vacation in years. Paris in spring felt like forgiveness. Blooming, indifferent, alive. I'd spent the morning walking along the Seine, unbothered, anonymous, until my phone buzzed. The message came from Rachel. "You're going to want to see this." Attached was a screenshot of a headline. Former Mercer Innovations CEO under federal investigation for fraud and data misuse. The photo beneath it showed Grant stepping out of a courthouse, face half hidden by sunglasses. That same carefully composed expression I knew too well. Calculated vulnerability. I stopped walking. The world blurred around me. Tourists, traffic, pigeons, sunlight, all noise fading behind the hum in my chest. He had finally done what everyone like him eventually does. He'd mistaken silence for safety. I didn't open the article right away. Instead, I sat at a cafe on Rue de Rivoli, ordered coffee I didn't taste, and let the memory of him pass through me like an old ache. He'd spent the last year reinventing himself as a consultant, a speaker, an evangelist for ethical innovation. I'd ignored it, the way you ignore an ex's wedding announcement, smiling at the absurdity of it, secretly relieved it wasn't your circus anymore. But now, it was federal, fraud, data misuse. When I finally read the story, the details were depressingly predictable. He'd been using archived Mercer data he no longer had rights to pitch a new analytics startup to investors. He'd doctored metadata to make it look original, repackaged my old frameworks, and claimed them as proprietary. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Rachel's message followed. Press is calling. They want your comment. You'll trend by noon whether you say something or not. I stared at the phone for a long time before replying. Say nothing. And for days, the news unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. Headlines shifted from industry icon under fire to Mercer's redemption arc crashes. Commentators debated whether his reform speeches had been preemptive damage control. Investors distanced themselves. Former employees gave statements. People wanted me to react, to confirm, to condemn, to gloat. I did none of it. Silence had once been a prison grant built around me. Now it was armor. Still, I couldn't deny the echo of satisfaction that rippled through me when I saw the footage of him in handcuffs. Brief, restrained, but undeniable. It wasn't revenge. It was gravity. The inevitable pull of truth catching up. Upper Khan. By the third week, the investigation turned into formal charges. And then something unexpected happened. Grant reached out. The email came through my assistant first. Flagged, forwarded, sanitized. The subject line read, "Foreclosure, not forgiveness." I almost deleted it, but curiosity, that old traitor, made me open it. He wrote, "Christina, I know you have no reason to respond. I wanted you to hear it from me before it becomes public record. The servers they're seizing include files with your early code. I kept backups, personal archives. I never used them maliciously. Not at first. I told myself it was nostalgia, not theft. I was wrong. You warned me once that the truth has its own momentum. I thought I could steer it. I was wrong about that too. If they ask, tell them whatever you need to. I deserve whatever comes next. Grant." I read it twice, then a third time. There was no apology in it. Not really. Just resignation disguised as self-awareness. But for the first time, there was no performance either. I closed the laptop and sat there for a while, feeling nothing and everything at once. And the next morning, Eliza called. "The prosecutors might reach out," she said. "They'll want to verify ownership of certain frameworks. I'll cooperate," I said. "Good. Just know, this could put you back in the spotlight." I sighed. I survived the spotlight once. I can survive it again. But what I didn't say was that I didn't want to. I didn't want my peace measured against someone else's downfall. That week, I returned home early from Paris. The office greeted me with its usual hum. Machines whirring, soft chatter, the faint smell of coffee and purpose. Maya met me at the door. "You okay?" she asked. "I will be," I said. She hesitated, then added, "They're saying he's facing real time, Christina. Like years." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe he'll finally learn what accountability feels like when it's not optional." She studied me, searching for anger that wasn't there. "Do you feel sorry for him?" "No," I said, "but I don't celebrate it either. He's living the consequence of what he built. So am I. We just built different things." In Sao, went over the next few months. The trial consumed the industry. Every article, every panel, every podcast dissected the fall of Grant Mercer like it was myth. I refused interviews, but I couldn't stop the story from spreading, because I was part of it whether I spoke or not. One evening, I got a message from Ryan Fitzgerald, the man whose wife, Claire, had once shared Grant's kind of betrayal. We'd stayed in touch occasionally, the quiet camaraderie of survivors. His message was short. "They always come back to the truth eventually. Proud of you for not needing to." That night, I dreamed of the old Mercer office again. The endless glass, the hum of fluorescent lights, the illusion of success built on noise. In the dream, I walked through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing. But this time, when I looked down, I saw flowers sprouting from the cracks in the tile. Small, persistent, alive. When I woke up, I realized that was what peace really was. Not the absence of echoes, but the growth that happens in their wake. In the day the verdict was announced, I didn't watch. Rachel burst into my office anyway, breathless, guilty. She said, Fraud, data misappropriation, obstruction. 2 years minimum. I nodded, setting my pen down. Are you okay? She asked. I'm fine, I said, and I meant it, because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't roar, it sighs. Then that weekend, I drove north along the coast. No destination, just motion. Wind tangled my hair through the open window, salt air filling the car. At a small overlook near Bellingham, I pulled over. The Pacific stretched out before me, endless and indifferent. I thought of Grant, of the courtroom, of his empire-turned artifact. I thought of Maya, of Lang Systems, of the world we were still building, one that didn't need to erase anyone to make space for something new. For years, I'd carried his shadow as proof of my survival. Now, I finally let it go. I whispered to the ocean, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. I forgive the lesson, not the man. The wind carried it away, dissolving into the vast salt-sweet horizon. And for the first time since 3:12 a.m. on that night years ago when he claimed my success as his own, I felt completely, irrevocably free. Since success, I learned, has a sound, not the roar of applause or the ding of a wire transfer. Those are fleeting. True success sounds like quiet footsteps in a hallway you built yourself. Lang Systems had become something beyond me. By the third year, the company operated in 6 countries. Our predictive architecture adopted by hospitals, universities, and even environmental agencies. We'd gone from startup to staple, and for the first time, I could step back without fearing collapse. That was when the offers started coming in. Emails from holding firms, letters from corporate acquisition boards, polite introductions wrapped in flattery. They all wanted the same thing: ownership. To them, Lang Systems wasn't a story of reclamation. It was an opportunity for expansion. I ignored the first few, but the one that arrived in early October was different. The letterhead read Oren Global Technologies, a multinational so vast, it practically ran the backbone of digital infrastructure. The CEO, Eleanor Oren, was something of a legend, a woman who'd built a $1 trillion empire without ever once pretending she owed anyone her success. The email was direct. Christina, we've watched Lang Systems grow with admiration. Your architecture has become industry standard, and your ethical model has redefined how innovation is managed. We'd like to discuss a full acquisition, one that ensures the longevity of your work and honors your principles. Name your terms. I'll clear my schedule. Eleanor Oren. I reread it 3 times. The woman had built her reputation on precision. She didn't waste words. Name your terms wasn't a courtesy. It was a challenge. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment overlooking the Sound, the city lights flickering below, and asked myself a question I hadn't faced since walking away from Mercer Innovations. What do you do when the empire you built stops belonging only to you? Then by morning, I'd made my decision. To meet her. If nothing else, I wanted to look power in the eye again, and see what kind of reflection it gave me now. Eleanor Oren's office was exactly as I expected. Sleek, impersonal, designed to make visitors feel small. Yet when she entered, she carried none of that energy. She was elegant, composed, but her presence wasn't intimidating. It was gravitational. Christina, she said, shaking my hand. I've wanted this conversation for a long time. I didn't think you noticed small companies like mine, I said. She smiled faintly. The good ones always start small. We sat. Coffee appeared without being ordered, the kind that costs more per ounce than some people's rent. Let me be direct, she said. Lang Systems represents everything this industry has lost. Ethics, transparency, credibility. I could fold your architecture into our ecosystem and preserve it forever. And in return? I asked. She didn't flinch. You'd step down as CEO, stay on as advisor. We'd retain your team, your name, even your public values. But ownership, full and legal, would transfer to Oren Global. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a number so large it barely looked real, enough to make anyone's life unrecognizably comfortable, enough to make walking away seem rational. Legacy, she said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Every builder eventually has to decide if their work should live past them. This ensures it does. Legacy. The word hit me like a whisper from the past. Grant used to talk about legacy too, but when he said it, he meant control. When Eleanor said it, she meant continuity. The difference was everything, and still, I couldn't say yes. I closed the folder and met her eyes. I need time. She nodded. Of course. Take as long as you need. Just remember, the world rarely waits for those who hesitate. Her parting words followed me out into the cool air, echoing like prophecy. I can. But for the next week, I did nothing but think. Every morning I walked to the office early, before anyone arrived, just to listen. The soft whir of servers, the quiet chatter of engineers, the gentle rhythm of keys tapping. These were the sounds of what I'd built. Lang Systems had never been about revenge. It had been about creation, about proving something could thrive without exploitation. But I'd never asked myself if it could survive without me. Maya noticed my distraction. You're thinking about selling, she said one afternoon, uninvited, but not unwelcome. I didn't deny it. Oren Global made an offer. Her expression shifted. Eleanor Oren? Yes. She's not Grant. No, I said, smiling faintly. She isn't. So what's the hesitation? I paused. What if letting go means losing what made us different? Maya thought for a moment. Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the real risk isn't losing what makes us different. It's believing we're the only ones who can protect it. Her words settled between us, soft but heavy. Maybe she was right. Maybe legacy wasn't about ownership at all. The following Monday, I visited the old Mercer building, what was left of it. It had been converted into a co-working space, the glass facade scrubbed clean of its logo, the interior redesigned to look collaborative. Walking those halls again felt like time folding over itself. I paused near what used to be my office, now occupied by strangers. A young woman sat at the desk, headphones in, coding something into existence. She didn't look up, didn't know me, didn't care about who'd once worked there. And that was the point. The world had moved on, and it was supposed to. At that evening, I called Eleanor. I've read your offer again, I said, and I've added something. I'm listening, she said. If I sell, it's conditional. Lang Systems remains a separate entity under your umbrella, with full transparency on profit distribution and research ethics. No restructuring without unanimous board approval. And one more clause. Call it the legacy clause. Every year, Oren Global funds 10 fellowships for underrepresented women in tech. They'll work under Lang Systems directly. No exceptions. There was silence on the other end. Then a low, approving laugh. You're not negotiating, she said. You're designing. I always do, I said. She didn't hesitate. Deal. The signing took place 2 weeks later. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions about valuation and vision. I smiled, answered what I had to, but my thoughts were elsewhere. As I handed the pen back, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not the relief of escape, but of completion. For years, I'd defined freedom as owning what I built. Now I understood. True freedom was knowing when to let it evolve beyond you. After the ceremony, Eleanor pulled me aside. You realize what you just did, don't you? What's that? You rewrote what succession looks like. Most founders sell out for wealth or ego. You sold for preservation. I smiled. Maybe I just learned from someone else's mistakes. That night, I walked home through the drizzle, the city lights blurring in reflections on the wet pavement. I passed a bookstore window and caught sight of my own reflection. Older, softer, still recognizably me. I thought about Grant, about Mercer, about every battle that had led here. He'd built something that crumbled when he stopped controlling it. I'd built something that could outlast me because I'd learned to release it. That was the real legacy, not the empire, not the name. The idea that creation could survive without the cage of ownership. As I reached my door, my phone buzzed. A message from Maya. We're all proud of you, but you should know. The team renamed the main server after you. It's called Lang Alpha. Don't be mad. I laughed out loud, standing in the rain. I wasn't mad. I was grateful. Because maybe legacy isn't what we leave behind. Maybe it's the people who keep building after we're gone. And when you step away from the center of the stage, you discover that silence has a different kind of gravity. It doesn't pull you down. It steadies you. For the first time in more than a decade, my calendar wasn't built around board meetings or quarterly reviews. No more flights to investor summits or 3 a.m. calls about server failures in Singapore. Lang Systems now thrived without me, and the world didn't end when I let it. At first, I didn't know what to do with the stillness. I would wake before sunrise out of habit, make coffee, and sit at my kitchen window watching ferries crawl across Elliott Bay. I told myself I'd sleep in tomorrow, but I never did. Success leaves a kind of scar tissue in the mind. It aches when nothing hurts. The quiet felt too big, too forgiving, so I filled it. The University of Washington invited me to lecture 1 semester a week on ethics in predictive systems. It was a modest title for something far more ambitious: how to build technology without losing your soul. The first day I walked into the auditorium, 70 students turned their phones toward me like a forest of tiny mirrors. I smiled anyway. I remembered being that young, believing brilliance was enough to protect you from the world. "My name is Christina Lang," I said, "and I'm here to teach you how not to become a headline." They laughed, nervous and curious, and in that laughter I recognized something: hope, still unbroken. Our teaching was nothing like leading. Leadership demanded certainty, direction. Teaching demanded vulnerability, the admission that what you know might change tomorrow. I found myself telling stories I'd once sworn never to repeat, about contracts written in bloodless language that stole lifetimes, about boardrooms where ideas had to scream to be heard. But I didn't tell them about Grant by name. I referred to him only as the lesson. One afternoon after class, a student named Layla waited by the door. She was small, intense, with dark eyes that carried both intelligence and exhaustion. "Professor Lang," she said, "how did you know when to walk away?" Her question caught me off guard. From what? From the company. From control. I considered her for a long moment. When keeping it started to look too much like proving something, she nodded slowly. "I'm building a startup with 2 friends. They listen until I disagree. Then they talk over me. Then you already know what to do," I said gently. She smiled. A small, brave thing. "I guess I do." As she left, I realized that inheritance wasn't always about money or titles. Sometimes, it was the permission to stop apologizing for wanting more. Months passed. The lectures grew into a routine. I published a paper, then a book, The Ethics of Reclamation. It wasn't a memoir, not exactly. It was a study in survival disguised as a textbook, how to build systems that didn't replicate the power structures that had broken us. When the book released, I expected polite academic interest. Instead, it went viral, shared on professional forums, quoted in articles, discussed in podcasts. My story, the one I'd tried to turn into theory, had become mythology. Students tagged me in posts: the woman who said no and built anyway, the one who chose peace over revenge. It was strange being turned into a symbol. I'd spent my whole career dismantling myths about genius and gender, and now I'd become one. One night I met Maya for dinner at a quiet restaurant on Capitol Hill. She'd just returned from a conference in Tokyo where Lang Systems had presented its climate forecasting AI to the United Nations. She looked radiant, self-assured in a way that only comes from knowing the world listens when you speak. "You're in every keynote now," she said, smiling as the waiter poured wine. "Half the talks I attend quote you. Tell them to stop," I said, half joking. "You can't stop people from turning you into a compass," she said. "You just hope they're pointing in the right direction." We ate, talked about her new research divisions, the fellowship program thriving under the legacy clause. She showed me photos of the first cohort, 10 women from 6 countries, each one building something extraordinary. One of them, she said, was designing a model to predict disaster relief needs before they were requested. "She calls it anticipatory compassion," Maya said proudly. I smiled at that phrase. Compassion as prediction. If Grant could see this version of our legacy, he wouldn't recognize it. And that was the point. And the next spring, the university invited me to give the commencement address. I almost refused. Public speeches still carried the ghost of Mercer's stages. But the dean insisted. "You've redefined what resilience looks like," he said. "They need to hear it from you." So I stood before a sea of graduates in black caps, their faces glowing with youth and hunger. The wind whipped at my notes, and for a moment, I considered abandoning them. Instead, I spoke without looking down. "When I was your age," I began, "I thought success meant control. I believed the goal was to hold power so tightly that no one could take it from me. But the tighter you grip, the less you can build. The real measure of success is how freely you can give it away." I told them about silence as power, about walking away as creation, about peace that didn't require permission. And when I finished, the applause was thunderous, not for victory, but for recognition. They weren't cheering for me. They were cheering for themselves, for the possibility that they might survive the world without becoming it. After the ceremony, I returned home to find a letter waiting. Handwritten, thick paper, elegant ink. It was from Eleanor Orrin. "Christina, Lang Systems Board just voted to name the new research wing after you, Maya insisted. And I didn't argue. It's not a monument. It's a promise. The Lang Center for Ethical Innovation will open next year. And before you object, yes, the fellowships are already oversubscribed. Some legacies can't be bought. They can only be tended. With respect, Eleanor, I read it twice, then 3 times. For years I'd believed legacy was what we left behind after we were gone. But this was legacy in motion. It was alive, iterative, self-renewing. I walked to the window, watching twilight settle over the city. The skyline glimmered with buildings that looked almost weightless, as if made of light instead of glass. Somewhere among them was Lang Systems, still humming, still creating. My empire that wasn't mine anymore. I whispered to the empty room. Good, keep going. And later that night, I opened my laptop and began a new document. The title came easily. Inheritance Rewritten. It wouldn't be another book or another lecture. It would be letters, open ones, to the next generation. Letters to every woman who'd ever been told she owed someone her brilliance. To every creator who mistook ownership for worth. The first line I typed was this: "You don't owe them your success. You owe yourself your peace." I sat there staring at the words, realizing that maybe that had been the message all along. Not revenge, not justice, just reclamation. Of time, of voice, of life. Sometimes, when I wake before dawn, I still check the company dashboard out of habit. The numbers scroll by like constellations. Users, updates, global impact reports. It's strange and wonderful to see it thrive without my fingerprints on every decision. It's like watching a child you raised become someone you admire. The world outside my window is still gray, still restless, but I am not. There's a line I used to repeat to myself in the dark days after losing Mercer. Peace tastes better than revenge, because it lasts longer. Now, years later, I'd amend it slightly. Peace tastes better than power, because it doesn't depend on anyone else's weakness. The next morning, I returned to campus early. Layla was there already, waiting outside my office. "I got funding," she said breathlessly, "for my startup. All women-led. We named it Continuum." "Beautiful name," I said. "We used your fellowship grant to get it started," she added. "I just wanted to say thank you." "You don't need to," I replied. "Just make something worth inheriting." She grinned. "That's the plan." When she left, I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of coffee and rain. I could almost hear the distant hum of Lang Systems, of 1,000 other projects blooming in its wake. That was inheritance rewritten, not a handoff, but a ripple. And I realized, finally, that I didn't need to be remembered to matter. Legacy wasn't about the name that survived. It was about the world that did. There's a peculiar stillness that comes when you've outlived every version of yourself. Not the eerie stillness of emptiness, but the quiet hum of equilibrium. The place where ambition, regret, and memory finally learn to coexist without devouring each other. Years passed like soft echoes. The city evolved again. New towers, new headlines, new names on building plaques. The skyline of Seattle, once a symbol of competition to me, had become a kind of living journal. Each light in the distance was a story I'd never know, a success that didn't need my approval. Lang Systems continued to expand. I received quarterly updates from Maya, though less frequently now. She didn't need my guidance anymore. She was guiding others. I loved that. Sometimes she'd attach photos from the fellowship cohorts. Women and men from every corner of the world, each holding the spark of an idea, each unaware of how profoundly they reminded me that creation is infinite. I was 54 when the first Lang Center for Ethical Innovation opened its doors in Berlin. I didn't attend the ceremony. I told Eleanor Oren I wanted the world to see the future, not its architect. She respected that, though she sent a bottle of wine and a handwritten note. "You've built an empire that doesn't need your name to sustain it. That's rarer than genius." I placed her note in a drawer and never opened it again. Not out of neglect, but because I'd already memorized every word. I spent that summer by the sea, a quiet town on the Oregon coast. Wind-torn cliffs, lighthouses, and beaches that glittered with fragments of green glass smoothed by decades of tide. I rented a house that smelled faintly of salt and cedar. The internet connection was unreliable, which suited me fine. Every morning, I walked along the shoreline, coffee in hand, notebook under my arm. Sometimes I wrote letters I never sent, to my younger self, to the women who came after. To Grant. I never mentioned his name, only the architect who mistook control for vision. Writing about him didn't hurt anymore. It felt more like annotating history. One morning, as I watched the fog pull away from the water, I thought about something my therapist had once told me years earlier. Peace isn't the absence of memory, Christina. It's when memory stops demanding your attention. That was what I'd found here. Peace that didn't need to be earned every day. Every now and then, a journalist still tried to resurrect the old story. The woman who took her husband's empire and rebuilt it. From betrayal to billion-dollar innovation. They always made it sound cinematic. Like revenge was the heartbeat that drove me. But revenge had been a single breath in a much longer song. When I agreed to an interview for the 10th anniversary of Lang Systems, I insisted on choosing the location, a community tech hub in Tacoma, where a group of teenage girls were learning to code. I wanted the reporter to see them, not me. The interviewer, a young man with an overconfident smile, began with the predictable question. Looking back, what do you think was the key to your success after losing everything? Not losing myself, I said simply. He blinked, expecting something flashier. So, resilience? Redefinition, I corrected. I didn't rebuild what I lost. I built what couldn't be taken again. He scribbled that down, eyes bright with the satisfaction of capturing a quote that would sound profound on social media. But that was fine. Let them make sound bites. I wasn't interested in being remembered as an icon. I wanted to be remembered as a pattern, a sequence others could adapt to their own design. And at night, the ocean became my soundtrack. The waves had a rhythm older than ambition. They reminded me that even destruction follows a cycle. Sometimes, when the wind rose, I could hear the faint chime of my neighbor's wind bells, fragile notes trembling in the dark. That sound, I realized, was the real empire. Something small, persistent, impossible to silence. I began writing again, slowly, unhurriedly. Not for publication this time, but for understanding. The manuscript that emerged was half memoir, half meditation. I titled it, The Quiet Empire. It began with a single sentence. Every empire begins as a whisper, an idea, a defiance, a refusal to vanish. I wrote about power, not as conquest, but as stewardship. About leadership as the courage to create structures that don't collapse when you step out of them. About forgiveness not as absolution, but as oxygen. It wasn't meant to inspire. It was meant to unburden. One rainy evening, years after the sale, I received an unexpected visitor. Maya appeared at my doorstep, her hair streaked with silver now, eyes still sharp. I was nearby for a conference, she said, holding a bottle of wine. Thought I'd see if the oracle of ethical tech still answers the door. We laughed for a long time before words caught up to us. She told me about her daughter, 10 years old, and already building circuits out of discarded toys. About the fellowship program, now expanded to 30 students annually. About Lang Systems' partnership with an environmental agency on climate modeling that predicted famine patterns months in advance. I listened, proud and quiet. When she finished, she looked at me for a long moment. Do you miss it? The work? The empire? I smiled. It's not mine to miss. It was never mine alone. She nodded, but then her expression softened. You know, Christina, you taught me how to build things that outlive their creators. But what you never said was that it's still okay to want to be remembered. Do you? I asked. She poured the wine, handing me a glass. Maybe, but I'd rather be remembered for how I treated people than for what I built. Then you've already succeeded, I said. When she left, I stood at the doorway long after her car disappeared into the mist. The night smelled of rain and driftwood. I realized then that my story had ended not in victory, but in continuance. The kind of ending that folds neatly into a beginning for someone else. The next morning, I walked the beach again, watching the tide reclaim footprints with patient inevitability. Everything we create, I thought, is a conversation with impermanence. The trick isn't to make it last forever. It's to make it matter while it does. Now, years later, when I finally stepped back from teaching, I held my last lecture in the Lang Center's amphitheater. The students, bright, restless, curious, filled every seat. I told them the truth I wished someone had told me. Power isn't something you earn once. It's something you re-choose every day. Not the power to dominate, but the power to define what matters. Don't inherit the world as it is. Rewrite it. When the lecture ended, they stood and applauded. I smiled, thanked them, and for the first time in my life, walked away without looking back. Outside, the air was crisp, the light gold. A woman I didn't know was standing near the entrance, holding a copy of The Quiet Empire. She looked at me shyly. "Your book changed how I see myself," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you." I took her hand gently. "Then it's yours now," I said. "The story belongs to whoever needs it next." That night, I returned to my house by the water. The horizon glowed faintly, the sky caught between night and dawn. I made tea and stood by the window, listening to the world breathe. Somewhere across the ocean, servers I'd once built were still running, still calculating futures, still trying to make sense of chaos. Somewhere, Maya's daughter was soldering wires to imagination. Somewhere, a young woman was opening The Quiet Empire for the first time. And here, in this small, unremarkable moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Peace, I realized, wasn't a finish line. It was an ecosystem, self-sustaining, alive. I thought of the girl I once was, the one who answered a 3:12 a.m. message from a man who claimed ownership of her success. And I wanted to tell her, you were never his empire. You were your own revolution. I turned off the light, leaving only the glow of the moon reflected on the glass, and whispered one final truth into the dark. Power isn't taken. It's remembered. And with that, I slept.